Welcome back. We're in the money mindset weeds today, and it gets way more interesting than save more. It's really about what wealth actually means, and why boring investing beats the fantasy stuff. And yes, we're definitely going to talk about why people keep treating investments like a checking account. That is the wildest part to me because people genuinely think their investment account is just extra cash. That mindset alone can wreck years of compounding. I love how the advice is basically, set it up properly so you can't mess it up. Which honestly is the most adult financial advice ever. Because the whole system is built around automation, not willpower. That's what I keep coming back to, though, is the gap between what people say and what they actually do. Everyone says they want wealth, but most people never define the life they want wealth for. Right. And then they end up chasing house ownership or some weird benchmark because society handed it to them. The whole buy a house and you've made it script is such a trap, especially when nobody's really running the numbers on taxes, maintenance, and interest. People act like rent is the only villain in the story. And the bigger point is that money decisions should match your actual rich life. Not your parents' rich life, not Instagram's rich life, your rich life. That's annoyingly simple, which usually means it's true. The calculator part is where it really hits, because compounding sounds fake until you see it. The jump from a few thousand a year to six figures later is insane. And the funny thing is, it's not even aggressive investing. It's not some genius hedge fund wizardry. It's just time not being a clown. Time really is doing all the heavy lifting while people are busy tweeting. That's why the low-cost, long-term approach matters so much. But what do you make of how boring it all sounds to people? Because nobody gets hyped watching a Vanguard account behave responsibly. No one's posting a screenshot of 7% annual return like it's fireworks. But they will absolutely post some coin that promises the moon. That's the human problem. We want huge returns with tiny effort. Exactly, and that's why the six-pack comparison lands so hard. Everybody wants abs in 10 minutes and wealth in one app download. Then they're shocked when neither body fat nor net worth obeys wishful thinking. I think the Warren Buffett point is huge, too, because it breaks people's fantasy of genius. The headline is not, be the smartest person, it's, start early and stay invested. And the fact that most of his wealth showed up after 60 is ridiculous. People miss that because they want the overnight version of a 50-year story. That's why keeping costs low is such a brutal edge. The fee numbers are almost offensive when you actually see them laid out. 1% feels harmless until it quietly eats your future. The finance industry loves tiny percentages that behave like termites. That is such a violent metaphor, but it works. And then there's the emotional side, because money shame makes people act irrationally. The crypto section really exposed that, honestly. Especially when people hear blockchain and instantly convert it into all-in. The most predictable plot twist ever is somebody saying diversification is for losers. And then the market does what the market does. The silence after the hype is always louder than the hype itself. Nobody wants to talk about losing money because it feels like social death. That status thing is real and it warps the story people tell. Which is why the portfolio rule is actually sane. A small fun allocation, not your whole life. You can have your little speculative circus, just don't rent the whole stadium to it. That's actually a perfect way to put it. What I also like is how the conversation shifts from money to skill placement. That part about moving your skills into a better market is massive. Same skill, different market, and suddenly your income multiplies. That's such a hard lesson for people who think effort alone should be rewarded equally. But effort in a crowded market is just effort in a crowded market. If everyone can do it, the pricing gets ugly fast. The graphic designer example was almost too clean, because the software never changed. Only the market changed, and the value exploded. That's the same logic for personal trainers, writers, everybody. And once you see that, you stop thinking linearly. A jump from $100 a month to $5,000 is not a small upgrade. You need some discontinuous change for that, not just work harder. That's what makes the AI angle feel so relevant, too. People should be asking where their skill becomes rare, not just available. Being available is not the same as being expensive. That line should be on a mug somewhere. The deeper thing, though, is that wealth is really behavior plus time. And once you understand your own values, the chessboard starts making sense. Then the question becomes, what are you actually optimizing for? Because if you never answer that, you end up rich in money and broke in life. Which is exactly why the rich life idea matters more than the number itself. Money without a direction is just expensive confusion. Okay, that's annoyingly quotable too. And it all ties back to habits. Automate, invest, keep costs low, stay calm. I feel like that's the anti-drama version of wealth building, which is probably why it works and nobody wants to hear it at first. Right, because drama sells and discipline compounds. Perfect place to leave it for today, honestly, because that tension is the whole game. We'll pick this up next time and get into the rules that make the whole thing practical. Episode 3 is where it starts getting even more tactical, so don't miss that. Welcome back. This episode is all about wealth, compounding, and playing the right game. And the wild part is how unsexy the answer keeps being. Bro, every time the boring thing wins, people act betrayed. That's because everyone's looking for a shortcut instead of a system. Exactly. And the system starts with knowing what you actually want, which is the part people skip like it's optional. They know they want money, but they have zero idea what money is for. That's the most expensive, vague answer in human history. And once you don't define the goal, every financial decision becomes noise. That's why the idea of a rich life matters so much, because it forces you to say what you actually care about, and what you do not care about, which is even rarer. Right? That's where the real freedom comes from. If you love travel, spend there and cut the nonsense elsewhere. If you love books and dinners and your weird little coffee ritual, keep those. Weird little coffee ritual is absolutely going in the budget. The point is intentionality, not deprivation. And the 4-number framework makes that real. Fixed costs, savings, investments, guilt-free spending. That last one sounds like therapy for your bank account. It kind of is because people are always emotionally overspending or emotionally underspending. They either feel guilty for everything or they never look at the numbers. And then they wonder why money feels chaotic. Money becomes chaotic when your habits are just vibes. Habits are not vibes, that's a great line. The automation piece is huge because it removes willpower from the equation. Wait, the checking account thing is the whole trap, right? Yes, because people treat investable money like spending money, then act shocked when emergencies have eaten their future. That is such a brutal sentence, but it's true. The money has to go where it belongs before your brain touches it. And that's why compounding actually works for normal people. Because you don't need to be a genius, you need repetition and time. Which is offensive to everyone who loves complicated solutions, especially people who want investing to feel like a superhero movie. But the calculator is the real plot twist. When you plug in modest amounts, the numbers get weird fast. $5,000 a year turning into 6 figures is insane. And that's with conservative assumptions, which is the important part. People always secretly want to assume the moon, though. They hear 7% and immediately start fantasizing about 27. That's exactly how they end up in trouble. Because once you start chasing return, you start breaking risk discipline. And then the whole point of wealth building collapses. Right, because the goal is durability, not a lucky headline. The boring portfolio is the one that survives your personality. That's actually a terrifyingly accurate way to say it. Warren Buffett is the example because the real magic was time. Not genius, not a secret trick, just compounding for decades. 99% of the wealth after 60 is wild. It changes the whole narrative about getting rich fast. Which means most people are obsessing over the wrong chapter. Exactly, and that obsession shows up in crypto too. Oh, the crypto section is always where the room starts sweating. Because everyone thinks they are the exception right until they aren't. A little bit is fine if the portfolio is strong and diversified. But all in is basically just gambling with better vocabulary. That's exactly it, and the vocabulary is always expensive. The shame around losses is another huge part of it. Nobody posts the boring aftermath when the trade blows up. Status makes people advertise wins and hide stupidity. That should honestly be on a poster somewhere. And that same psychology is why people misread houses too. Because owning feels like success even when the math is ugly. Exactly, and if you don't run the numbers, you can fool yourself. The emotional story is always louder than the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet never gets invited to the dinner party. That's a crime against good decision-making. But the deeper lesson is about playing your own game. Like, what do I want? What matters? What can I ignore? Once you know that, you can spend with more confidence and invest with more calm. And that calm is worth more than most people realize, because panic is expensive in every direction. The other thing I love is the career angle, because money is not just investing. Right, and the smartest move is often raising your earning power, especially if you're in a field where your skill is common. That market mismatch idea is huge. Same skill, different market, different value. That is one of the most practical wealth ideas in the whole conversation. And also one of the most annoying, because it means moving, or reskilling, or repositioning, or charging differently. Like a trainer who stops selling hours and starts selling outcomes. Or a designer who moves from nightclub flyers to luxury branding. Same software, completely different paycheck. The market is basically saying, we value this version more. Brutal, but yes. And that's where people get stuck, because they think income growth has to be linear. But sometimes the jump is discontinuous. Exactly, and investing is the opposite, where time does the heavy lifting. So one side is leap, the other side is patience, which is a great way to explain why people hate finance. They want excitement everywhere, but money rewards restraint. And then the rules around emergency funds and big purchases make sense. 1 year of emergency cash is a sleep-at-night number, which is probably the most underrated financial metric. Sleep at night is an actual return, honestly. Paying cash for large expenses also changes the emotional quality of the decision, because debt makes everything feel smaller until it doesn't. And then the bill arrives like a villain, a very patient villain. The bigger point is that money should support the life, not distort it. That's why the best advice here feels weirdly personal. It is personal because money is always identity plus math. Identity plus math is a great way to ruin someone's cocktail conversation, or make it the best one in the room. Because once you understand your own patterns, the whole game gets simpler. Not easier, but simpler. Exactly, and that's the difference between confusion and control. All right, that's a good place to land this one. We got compounding, crypto, career moves, and the whole rich life framework. Which is a lot, considering we were trying not to be boring. Somehow we still ended up inside a calculator. But that's the point, because the calculator tells the truth. Episode 3 is where we get even more tactical. We'll pick it up there and get into the rules that make this practical. Welcome back, because this episode is basically money myths getting hit with a chair. We're talking compounding, crypto, career leverage, and why rich life beats random status. Also, somehow the calculator wins again. The wild part is how boring the real path looks on paper, which is exactly why people ignore it and chase the shiny disaster. That is the most honest summary of finance ever. What I keep coming back to is the idea that investing is not a reward for being rich. It is one of the ways you become rich in the first place. And that flips the whole psychological script, because people think they need a giant pile first. Then they sit on cash forever and call it being responsible. Meanwhile, inflation is doing a mugging in the background. The automation piece matters too, because it removes the drama from the process. I actually love that 4-bucket system. Bills, savings, investing, guilt-free spending. That last bucket is so underrated because it stops people from self-sabotaging. If every purchase feels like a moral failure, the system breaks. Exactly, and then people binge spend later like they were trapped in a financial monastery. A monastery with credit cards is a dangerous thing. The calculator example is great because it makes time visible in a way your brain just cannot. $400 a month sounds trivial until you run it for 20 or 30 years. Then suddenly you are staring at 6 or 7 figures and wondering where the joke is. The joke is that you called it trivial. Exactly. The money was just sitting there waiting for patience to stop being annoying. What I like is that the whole argument is anti-fantasy, but not anti-ambition. That's the distinction people miss, because they hear conservative and think timid. It is actually extremely aggressive to invest early and consistently for decades. That is a way bolder bet than throwing one moonshot at a coin and praying. And the crypto trap is really about emotional design, not just returns. Because people are not buying a token, they are buying a story about themselves. They want to be the person who saw it early, who got in before everyone else. They want the identity upgrade more than the asset, which is a terrible reason to put your net worth on fire. The shame piece is huge, too, because losers go quiet and winners go loud. So the timeline gets distorted and everybody thinks the top is the whole market. That is why status is such a sneaky force in money decisions. People do not just want money, they want money that signals something. A house, a car, a coin, a watch, a portfolio screenshot. Half the time, the screenshot is the product. Honestly, yes, the screenshot is the emotional return. But the richer idea here is that you can define your own scoreboard. That is what I keep hearing in this framework. Pick what matters, then fund it intentionally. If you love travel, fund travel. If you love a house, own that choice consciously. If you hate status, stop paying for status like it is oxygen. That one hurts because it is so obvious after the fact. And the career angle ties in perfectly, because wealth is not only investment returns. It is also whether your skills are priced in the right market. That part about the same skill becoming wildly more valuable in a different market is crazy. Same work, different arena, completely different outcome. That is where the big jumps come from, not from tweaking your hourly rate forever. And I think people underestimate how trapped they are by the market they first landed in. They assume their price is their ceiling instead of asking whether the market is the problem. That example of the trainer is perfect because it starts with simple client growth and ends with leverage. More clients, higher lifetime value, better packages, longer retention, all of it compounds. Even the fitness business has a compounding problem, which is kind of funny. Everything is compounding if you stop acting like a tourist. That is the phrase, honestly, because tourists chase novelty and residents build systems. And the house-buying skepticism is another good example of system thinking. People see rent and think house automatically wins, but they do not price in everything else. Taxes, maintenance, interest, flexibility, emotional fit, all of it matters. A lot of financial decisions are just vibes dressed up as adulthood. That is outrageously true and mildly offensive. The reason the rich life framework works is because it makes trade-offs explicit. What do you actually value, and what are you willing to say no to? Once you answer that, money stops being a fog and becomes a tool. And then you can play the game instead of being played by it. That feels like the right place to end this stretch because it is simple but not easy. We've got the mindset, the math, and the market game all mapped now. Episode 3 is where we turn all of this into even more practical rules. We'll pick it up there and get into the moves that make this real. Welcome back, because this episode is all about wealth getting weirdly simple and weirdly hard at the same time. We're talking compounding, account structure, and why people keep gambling when boring math actually wins. I love that the answer is basically, stop treating your investment account like a snack drawer. That is a criminally accurate description of how people use it. The whole move is automation because discipline is unreliable at 11:47 p.m. Exactly, your checking account should do the moving, not your mood. And that calculator moment was wild because $5,000 a year suddenly became real money. Bro, 30 years of patience and that turns into 6 or 7 figures without a miracle. Which is why people hate it, because no one wants to hear, be patient for decades. They want the screenshot, not the spreadsheet. And that's the whole trap. Because status stories are loud and compounding is quiet. The crypto thing is such a perfect example of that emotional bug in us. If someone says their portfolio is 100% in one coin, that is not investing. That is performance art with a wallet attached. I do like the nuance, though, because a little risk is fine if it stays a little. The second people confuse a fun bet with a retirement plan, it gets ugly fast. What I found more interesting was the market game. Because that's where people can actually change outcomes. Right, same skill, different market. Suddenly the price changes dramatically. A designer in nightclub flyers versus luxury brands is basically the same labor with a different audience. Same software, totally different paycheck, which is honestly offensive but true. And that's the part most people miss, because they only think in tiny increments. They ask how to make 20% more, when the real question is how to change the entire game. That is a much scarier question because it might require reinvention. But it's also more honest because wealth is rarely one clever move. It's usually boring systems, patient investing, and putting your skills where they're scarce. That's why the rich life question matters so much, because otherwise you just accumulate without direction. And then people end up with money and still feel broke in their own heads. Which is the perfect mess to clean up next time. We'll leave it there for now, because this one got delightfully nerdy in the best way. Episode 3 is where we turn all of this into sharper rules and real-life moves.